Sorry.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Michael Irizarry. I'm a neurologist, and I serve as Senior Vice President and Deputy Chief Clinical Officer at Eisai, the company that makes lecanemab. First, I'd like to thank the audience, the panel, and the ICER organization for the opportunity for Eisai to share our comments. In the phase 3 clinical trial of lecanemab in early AD, all primary and key secondary endpoints were met with a high level of statistical significance. And the large phase 2 dose ranging study that we performed in early AD was also supportive of these results. So today I'd like to discuss the phase 3 results in the context of clinical meaningfulness of disease-modifying treatments, system readiness, and access. So first, I'd like to extend the discussion regarding the clinical meaningfulness of Alzheimer's disease, especially disease-modifying treatments. The clinical benefit of the slowing of clinical decline in early AD with lecanemab treatment is supported by the convergence of evidence from the Clarity AD study that you've heard. Lecanemab delayed progression in scales of cognition and function, ranging from 26 to 37% slowing, across domains within scales and across clinically relevant subgroups. Lecanemab delayed progression of disease by slope analysis of the CDR sum of boxes, a delay of 5.3 months over the 18-month trial, and I'll mention that again a little later. And also, as you've heard, by this time to event analysis of progression to the next stage of Alzheimer's disease, which showed a hazard ratio of 0.69. The confidence intervals were 0.57 to 0.83, so captured within the range of the modeling. The trial also showed 23 to 56% slowing in decline of measures of health-related quality of life, and a 38% slowing of accumulation of caregiver burden. Lecanemab's effects on amyloid, tau, neurodegeneration, and gliosis biomarkers provide a biological basis for the treatment effects and are consistent with disease modification. And by way of clarification, 68% of lecanemab treated subjects were amyloid negative by this 30 centiloid criteria after 18 months of treatment. And importantly, lecanemab has a safety profile with important adverse events of infusion reactions, amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, edema, and hemosiderin deposition, as you've heard. Now, the overall percent slowing of disease progression on these scales of cognition and function is at the group level, as you've heard. And this percent metric is more informative than the absolute differences, because the absolute treatment difference between treatment and placebo increases over time. And we see that within the data of the clinical trial. These differences between treatment groups and clinical trials have to be distinguished from the definition of clinically meaningful change at the individual patient level, or the minimally clinically important difference. This is typically anchored on the progression to the next stage of AD, where the patient either requires additional treatment or additional supportive care. And Clarity AD directly showed a delay in progression to the next stage of disease by a 31% reduction in the relative risk relative to placebo. If we conservatively set this minimally clinically important change at 1.11, the placebo will reach that level of decline in 12.7 months, and treatment with lecanemab delays that level of progression by another 5.3 months. So that's not reached until after 18 months of treatment. And projecting across the lifetime of Alzheimer's disease, if we expect this to continue to progress over time, this could translate to an additional 2 or 3 years for patients in earlier stages of Alzheimer's disease. So lecanemab treatment allows individuals to remain in earlier stages of Alzheimer's disease for a longer period of time. Given the time constraints, I'll stop there, and really appreciate the panel's consideration of these points and providing a comprehensive and fair assessment that aligns with the values of patients, caregivers, and the broader community. Thank you.
Thank you, and it looks like we have time for questions. David.
Thanks. Michael, I was just wondering, as you were describing that, the 1.11, is that an individual patient analysis looking at people who did and didn't get to that? And why 1.11, not 1 or 0.5 or something like that?
Yeah, so these types of analyses there are several publications. So the Andrews publication is commonly cited, and it evaluates data on clinicians and what the CDR sum of boxes change would be that initiates a change in care. And often this is anchored either on progression in the next stage of disease or other scales. The range of MCID varies on the population that's used and the stage of disease. So for MCI, the MCID has been as low as 0.45, and for mild AD, it ranges from 1 to 1.5. I selected 1.11 as the example for this particular case because that's when at the end of 18 months, that's the decline in the lecanemab treatment group. The placebo group has already reached that level of decline 5.3 months before.
I see. So it's an average across all patients. It's not this is the number of patients who hit that level of decline in one group versus the other group.
Right. Overall, it's about 30% fewer patients hit that level of decline, whatever you set that level of decline as.
Okay. It's just, we would love an a priori cut point by somebody who hasn't looked at the data saying, we're going to look at this and say, this is how many got to a substantial level of decline, to do the sort of analysis that Dr. Lin was asking for.
Yeah, the optimal approach is actually to use the time to progressing to the next stage of disease, because that is a firm time point, this CDR staging.
And we did use that, as you know.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Stop there.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next
Can I
comment.
add one thing? Sorry. There was so in the mention of the 2 to 3 years, just to link that back to our model, we were suggesting, based on the evidence using the direct clinical evidence, about an additional 1 year in early Alzheimer's disease. So we've already talked about some of the modeling differences, but I just wanted to orient to what we were seeing in our evidence that we presented using the direct outcomes from the trial.
Great, thank you. Katie Herron.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Awesome. So Dr. Pearson, Dr. Rind, Dr. Whittington, ICER staff, members of CTAF, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to address you today. My name is Katie Herron. I'm a pharmacist by training and a health outcomes researcher, and I work currently in the value evidence and outcomes group within Eli Lilly and Company. For more than 3 decades, Lilly has been committed to bringing innovative Alzheimer's diagnostics and therapeutics to patients across the globe. Lilly believes that the recent and emerging data from Alzheimer's studies validates the amyloid cascade hypothesis, and we remain confident in the strength of data which demonstrated an association between plaque reduction and positive effects on clinical outcomes. We believe that further studies, including our own phase 3 study of donanemab, will continue to demonstrate this strong association. While we're not here today to discuss donanemab, Lilly believes that donanemab has the potential to be a safe and effective treatment option for those affected by this terrible disease. And we fully intend to continue to work with patients, payers, policymakers, providers, and purchasers to evaluate the fastest pathways to make this potential treatment option widely available to people living with Alzheimer's disease. Because Alzheimer's is a relentlessly progressive disease, every day that goes by means more people develop symptoms and experience further declines in cognition and function. These individuals and their loved ones desperately want and need timely access to safe and effective treatments that can significantly delay disease progression. We urge ICER to more adequately capture the burdens and benefits that are important to people affected by Alzheimer's in this assessment and any future assessments in Alzheimer's disease. It is widely recognized that the healthcare system perspective adopted by ICER as its typical base case for cost effectiveness analysis fails to account for much of the clinical and societal burden of Alzheimer's disease. This burden includes elevated severity and disability, health inequities, the cost of institutionalization, and family impacts. And to better account for these burdens, ICER should consider adjusting its base case thresholds to reflect that full impact on Alzheimer's disease as supported by recent scholarship on the topic. Further, we urge ICER to continue to use more recent studies of caregiver utilities in their modeling efforts, which better reflect the increasing burden of Alzheimer's disease on both patients and their loved ones. So transparent and comprehensive value assessments are so vitally important to ensure that access is not impeded for patients who need Alzheimer's treatments. Currently, there are unprecedented restrictions placed on patient access to Alzheimer's disease therapies by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Lilly really urges CMS to remove those coverage barriers for patients to access safe and effective Alzheimer's treatments. CMS's policies and actions really undermine an entire drug class, and the agency should revisit its decision to not reconsider its national coverage determination on monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid for Alzheimer's. Specifically, we believe that coverage with evidence development of any kind is unnecessary, inappropriate, and unethical for FDA-approved products, and we reiterate our call for CMS to provide full and unrestricted coverage for on-label use of this class of therapies. In closing, I really want to just reiterate Lilly's steadfast commitment to researching and developing diagnostics and therapeutics that address the enormous health, economic, and societal burden of Alzheimer's disease. On behalf of Eli Lilly, thank you for your time and consideration of our comments.
Thank you. I wanted to see if anyone from ICER wanted to respond.
Just two small points of clarification. We did include the cost of long-term care in the healthcare sector perspective. So that was included in our healthcare sector perspective. And then we do present both as co-based case analyses for this assessment.
Any other comments from ICER or CTAF? Okay, we will move to our next commenter, Russ Paulson.
Hi there, I am Russ Paulson, Chief Operating Officer, USAgainst Alzheimer's. My conflicts are disclosed here, and I did at the beginning of this webinar as well. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things with you all. One is the evidence report may mislead readers in talking about the published literature, and Dr. Lin mentioned it also as having established an MCID, a minimal clinically important difference for the CDR sum of boxes and ADAS-Cog. The report does note that there's, quote, not universal agreement, but that understates the controversy. For one, the lead author on the paper that the evidence report cites for the CRSB has said that it's being used in an inappropriate manner, but more importantly, every one of the papers that's been done on this shares a fatal flaw, and that is that assessing an MCID is by definition a question for patients. And all of these papers, all three of them, have anchored on clinicians' opinions. Now, no offense to the clinicians on the group, but MCID is defined in relevant part as the smallest difference in score which patients perceive as beneficial. So it's a definitional issue, and the papers that are out there that are being cited don't meet the definition. What do we know? We've been working at USAgainst Alzheimer's for several years now on understanding what matters to patients. You heard Doreen eloquently state her opinion. We've talked to about 350 patients across the disease spectrum in various validated forms, qualitative, quantitative research. We have 3 papers published so far. Here's what we know. At the early stages where this drug is targeted, as Doreen actually said, success is largely about progression. Their top goals: stop progression, improve memory, slow progression. At the highest levels, patients care about progression. And that's why we're pleased to see the lecanemab data showing that already 3 months into the trial, there was slower progression on average. And this is one thing that's different from lecanemab and the symptomatic drugs that are already out there, sort of standard of care. That difference got bigger. If you look at the Kaplan-Meier curves that were not in the ICER evidence report, but I believe that's the one Dr. Karlowicz referenced in the appendix, they get bigger over time. Now, at a granular level, we know that our quantitative research shows that patients care about 42 specific items. The CDR sum of boxes captures 12 of them. No one measure captures all 42, But that's why it's important that lecanemab had positive results on so many outcome measures, on activities, daily living, quality of life, as well as outcome measures on CDR Sum of Boxes. In fact, there was no outcome measure on which it did not beat placebo. And I think it's important that we not cherry pick results like saying, well, it's just the CDR Sum of Boxes or it's just the ADAS-Cog. You look at the quality of life measure, it was a 56% difference between placebo mean and treated mean. If you look at the the ADLs, a 37% difference between placebo mean and treated mean. Everyone, they went in the right direction. And that's a very helpful and very clinically meaningful thing to patients. I think it's also important to look at the actual chart. And somebody asked about this earlier, and I didn't have it pulled up. But the difference when Dr. Karlovich did give one example, but on some really important subscales of the CDR Sum of Boxes, the difference between a 0.5 and a 0.1 is the ability to go to the grocery store by yourself or not, needing help, losing that kind of independence. Giving up your hobbies is the difference between a 0.5 and a 1 on the CDR Sum of Boxes. And I do also want to say Dr. Redberg's comment earlier about a lot of people forget their keys. Mild cognitive impairment is not forgetting your keys. If you look at the disutilities that Dr. Whittington's modeling showed, the disutility for MCI is greater than the disutility for moderate to severe migraine. This is no small disease, and to slow the progression is important. Clinically meaningful. Clearly, the difference between dependence and independence matters to patients. Thank you.
David?
Thanks. Russ, I just wanted to comment on the notion that going forward, we should expect to see the curves continue to widen, because that, of course, if you look at the CDR Sum of Boxes curves, that looks like what's happening. If you look at some of the other scales, though, that doesn't look like what's happening. And there's a real tendency in all of us looking at life tables and survival curves to look at kind of what's happening at the end of them and assume they'll continue to move apart. And I would just comment that having looked at many, many life tables in many, many different treatments across many, many different diseases, when people actually then carried them out further, a lot of the ones that looked like they were separating didn't continue to separate. It's not that it couldn't be true, it could happen, but I would just urge caution about believing that that's what's going to happen. It might, but I'm not sure yet.
Thanks.
Any other comments or responses from ICER? Okay, we'll move to our next commenter, Susan Pession.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Pession, and I serve as President and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on the evidence report. I'm going to start by providing some context. ICER reports like the one being discussed today are crafted for health insurance companies. That's the lens through which ICER views people living with Alzheimer's disease, as if they are insurance products nearing the end of their useful life. Today, we're talking about the value of an FDA-approved treatment called Leqembi that slowed progression of early Alzheimer's by 5.3 months over an 18-month trial. Even some neurologists who were skeptical of Aduhelm say Leqembi could be a game changer. The Alzheimer's Association, the American Academy of Neurology, and more than 200 research experts in the space have asked CMS to revise its extreme Medicare coverage restrictions. Earlier this week, the Veterans Health Administration, which routinely utilizes ICER's reports in their formulary deliberations, announced that it will widely cover Leqembi. With that context in mind, I want to make a few points about ICER's Leqembi report. First, ICER utilizes its equal value of life years gained, or EV-LYG metric in the report. However, claims that it fixes the biases of the QALY are misleading. The only difference between the EV-LYG and the QALY is that the EV-LYG uses a static health state preference value of 0.85, as opposed to using values that vary by condition. The calculation is done the same way for both by multiplying the amount of time patients are likely to spend in their disease state. Both measures consider treatments that cure disease or extend life as more cost-effective than treatments that primarily improve quality of life. The National Council on Disability considers the EV-LYG discriminatory, and so do hundreds of patient advocacy organizations, including the Alliance. We're concerned about how the EV-LYG measure is being showcased by ICER as a reasonable alternative to the QALY. The Inflation Reduction Act allows Medicare to set prices starting in 2026 and left the door wide open to how it will be operationalized. The EV-LYG maintains the same discriminatory lineage as the QALY and should not be considered a viable alternative. Second, ICER's methodologies have a uniquely negative impact on communities of color who experience a higher prevalence of Alzheimer's, are often diagnosed at later stages of disease and with more comorbidities, and all factors that force the cost effectiveness threshold for treatments to rise. In the equity white paper ICER released 2 days ago, they openly acknowledged that the status quo of traditional cost effectiveness methodology is quote unquote no longer acceptable. In its Leqembi report, ICER uses a tortured health improvement distribution index, or HIDI. The HIDI estimates that Black Americans would receive 1.6 times the health improvements from Leqembi as compared to the same size group of Americans without regard to race. However, this HIDI metric is in the report's contextual considerations, which aren't included in ICER's base case value assessment and final recommendation. I know someone said you do them, but they're not in the final recommendation. So what's the point here? Making up a new equity metric that you don't use rather than doing the hard work of wholesale reform to your base assessment is tokenism rather than real reform. Third, ICER's Leqembi report penalizes family caregivers for the productivity and economic impacts of keeping a loved one at home. In its response to submitted comments, ICER states, this treatment is not restoring to a health state that doesn't involve caregiver time spent. Now, from the perspective of people living with Alzheimer's, family caregivers, and society, there's significant intrinsic value to prolonging independence and identity that just isn't reflected in medical costs or solely captured in caregiver burden. That represents real time where cognition, personality, and some of the ability to still care for oneself remains intact. And if this value is not reflected in the value assessment, that's a deficiency of ICER's model. Individuals living with Alzheimer's meet with their healthcare providers, often alongside family caregivers, to discuss the benefits and risks of whether to take a drug or not. It takes a lot of hubris for ICER, private payers, and Medicare to insert themselves between patients and their doctors in terms of that benefit risk assessment. None of ICER's health economists know better than the biomedical experts at the FDA or people's doctors. And more importantly, none of you know what matters most to people who are living with Alzheimer's right now and their families. Dr. Pearson, both last year and at this meeting, you spoke very poignantly about your mom and your family's experience with Alzheimer's. I'm sure you would agree that it would be inappropriate for ICER to help set up a scenario in which middle and low-income people can't get coverage, all the while knowing wealthy Americans can private pay for any medication they might want to have for themselves or for their loved ones. Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much for those comments. And I think we have David.
Sure, I'll respond to that. Ms. Pession, you write editorials attacking ICER. We still let you come here and speak. And it would be nice if, as you speak about ICER, you spoke truth. That starting with things that are untrue about ICER, like crafted for insurance companies, for an independent group that both tells insurance companies sometimes to pay more and sometimes manufacturers to charge less. It's just inappropriate. And then you throw things at the wall as if they're all true, one after another, attacking the model in weird ways, saying things that aren't correct about the EV-LYG. It's discriminatory. It's great to use the word discriminatory because it calls up all sorts of feelings in people. But the EV-LYG isn't discriminatory against anyone. It just isn't. And just throwing this stuff out there like that is inappropriate. Here is a conversation among people trying to understand what best to do. We've given you a chance to talk. At least try to speak truth.
May I respond if
I'm
we're
sure
having
you
a
can.
conversation? So the description around the EV-LYG that I got was actually from ISPOR, which I think you would agree is a reputable place. And in terms of the discriminatory aspects, I'm looking to resources from the National Council on Disability, which is a nonpartisan, government designated entity. And they have written extensively on these issues to the CBO, to Congress, and I think to ICER, but I'm not sure. In any event, that's where I have looked. So I'm not just sort of relying on my own opinion about things. It's coming from respected sources. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd love to just jump in and correct some of that. And I'd be happy to sit through and walk through some scenarios. We can pull up a model and we can show how the EVOI is not discriminatory in life extension. Dr. Anirban Basu's paper that introduces the HYT, the EVOY, and compares that to the QALY is a tremendous resource for everyone who's listening to this conversation. Look at his resource. It's terrific in showing how the EVOY is not discriminatory in periods of life extension. So the main premise here is that with the quality adjusted life year, life extension for patients with lower quality of life could be valued less than similar life extension. That's what we are trying to avoid. The EVOY avoids that. And I'm proud to work for an organization that has led the charge, one of the first organizations to put in an alternative measure to the quality adjusted life year. I can send that paper to anybody, email me, and I will send that to you. I will walk you through scenarios. This is very important. It is not discriminatory, and I'm happy to show that with numbers.
I'm going to move on. So sorry, because I want to keep us a little bit closer to our timeline, but thank you. Our final commenter, James Taylor. James Taylor, are you able to, maybe you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Sorry for that delay, and hello. I'm Jim Taylor, and I'm the president and CEO of the Voices of Alzheimer's, a new advocacy organization that is led by people living with cognitive illness. Our mission is to empower people living with or at risk of Alzheimer's and other cognitive illnesses to acquire equitable access to innovative care and treatment. This is my wife, Jerry, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's over 10 years ago, and she is my inspiration and to whom I dedicated much of this work. We want to thank ICER for the opportunity to provide comments on the draft evidence report on lecanemab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Today, I want to emphasize three primary points that I believe are essential for ICER to consider. First, the patient perspective is paramount. Second, value assessments must give great weight to what matters most to patients, those living with the disease. And lastly, we must act with urgency. It's critical to consider the experience of those of us living with Alzheimer's. We sincerely appreciate ICER's efforts to interview people living with the disease and care partners. This is an important step toward understanding the patient's journey and the experiences of those of us living with the disease. However, we do not feel that this is enough. We were disappointed that these experiences did not seem to be fully understood or incorporated by all evaluators. This is a missed opportunity. This lived experience is paramount. Personal insight must not be underestimated. People living with the disease and care partners have a unique and valuable perspective, and that perspective cannot be replicated by any other group. We strongly encourage ICER to take steps to ensure that the input from people living with Alzheimer's and care partners is truly heard by all evaluators, and that their need is fully taken into account as part of this and future evaluations. It is time that we, people living with the disease and care partners, have a seat at your table. And we welcome the opportunity to do that and want to stress that the critical life decisions that are being made should always include us. Second, ICER should consider what matters most to those living with the disease. And what matters most to us is activities of daily living and quality of life. There are many validated tools to measure ADL and quality of life that can be directly taken into account the value for patients. We would also recommend that ICER use additional resources such as surveys, interviews, observations. Having multiple sources of data can help ensure evaluators are getting more comprehensive understanding of the patient experience and what is meaningful to them. Please do not fail to grasp the importance of this point. We understand the need for researchers to have cognitive evaluations, but for your true clients, those of us living with the disease, these cognitive evaluations are less important. ADL measures help us to understand the real-world impact of the disease and help us to identify areas where treatment would be more valuable and more impactful. Finally, we must act with urgency. On behalf of the Alzheimer's community, we are calling upon ICER to act swiftly and reconsider its framework for assessing these and future Alzheimer's treatments. We strongly urge the organization to use a framework that fully incorporates the perspective of people living with Alzheimer's and care partners and prioritizes what matters most to us. We would be delighted to begin a dialogue with you on any reassessment. These proposed value assessments will impact access to life-enriching and life-prolonging treatments for patients, treatments that will give those living with the disease more time to spend with their families, their loved ones, and more independence. It is critical that ICER understand this and act with urgency. 2,000 people daily move from the early stage of the disease, where these treatments are effective, to the moderate stage, where hope is currently lost for intervention. Time is of the essence to us. We must act now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank, those were really beautiful comments. And I do want to thank all of the commenters. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pearson.
Yeah, well, thank you also from me to Mr. Taylor and to the others who came. We have these opportunities for public comment. They're not the only time. We obviously hope to be in touch with people who are directly affected by our work. So I hope that that's a process that we can continue to examine and improve at. Thank you very much again. We will try to we need to keep to our agenda. So that means we're going to have a shorter lunch. We will re-meet here at 11:50, 10 minutes before the hour, 11:50 Pacific time. So we'll come back at that point to have further deliberation and the voting on the clinical effectiveness, potential other benefits, and the long-term value for money. We'll see you then.